Good day, everyone. This is your microeconomics instructor, Loreto Atamosa, and I would like to welcome all of you to this learning experience in microeconomics. Today, we're going to focus on lesson 2 of our learning experience in microeconomics, which is all about demand and supply. In this lesson, we will focus on demand and supply, how buyers and sellers interact, and how they affect market prices. So at the end of this video, everyone is expected to learn about demand, supply, and equilibrium in markets for goods and services, explain the shift in demand and supply for goods and services, and to identify the changes in equilibrium price and quantity. Ready? Let's go! Now, I have a question. How much are you willing to pay for your mobile load to be connected to the internet? Or what will you do if your tuition increases? Every day, people ask questions like this relating to the concept of supply and demand. So, what is demand and supply? Demand is the desire consumers have for a good or service. The more people who want a good or service, the higher the demand for it. Supply, on the other hand, is the total amount of a good or service available for consumption. So, the higher the amount of a good or service produced and made available to consumers, the larger supply will be. Supply and demand have a big impact from the prices of products and services. Supply and demand are fundamental concepts in economics. Usually, they're represented by a graph like this: demand and supply. So, what does this mean? Let's try to have a deeper understanding about the law of demand first. The first thing you have to understand about demand is the law of demand. Here is an illustration. As you can see, there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. That means when the price goes down, the quantity demanded increases, and if the price goes up, the quantity demanded is low. Let us have a deeper understanding about demand. Demand pertains to the quantity of a good or service that buyers are willing and able to buy at given prices within a given period of time. So, there are two components of demand: willingness to buy and ability to pay. Let us have a closer look as to demand, and let's say the demand for cars. Now, you are willing to buy a car, for example. Sadly, you don't have the ability to pay for it. Are you included in the demand of cars? Let's try to check the components of demand. First component is willingness to buy. Yes. Second, ability to pay. No. Demand? No. So, you are not included for the demand of cars. Another example is that you want to receive bouquet of flowers on Valentine's Day. Since bouquet of flowers is not that expensive, you have the ability to pay for it. But since it's Valentine's Day, you don't want to buy it because you want someone to give it to you. Let's try to check the components of demand again. Number 1, willingness to buy. No. Ability to pay? Yes. So, demand? No. So you are not included for the demand of bouquet of flowers. Remember that demand pertains to the quantity of a good or service that buyers are willing and able to buy at given prices within a given time period, and market is where buyers and sellers meet. It is the place where they both trade or exchange goods or service. In other words, it is where their transaction takes place. Take note that when there is a demand for a good or service, there is a market. Now, there are 3 most common ways of analyzing demand: demand schedule, demand curve, and demand function. So, take a look at this demand schedule, and let's say demand for milk. As you can see, when the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. When the price goes down to 4, 3, 2, and 1, the quantity demanded increases. Now, when you plot these points, you're gonna get a demand curve, which looks like this. It's a downward sloping curve showing the law of demand. So, a demand curve is a graphical representation showing the relationship between price and quantities demanded per time period. A demand curve has negative slope, thus it slopes downward from left to right. The downward slope indicates the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. In a typical representation, the price will appear on the left vertical axis or the y-axis, the quantity demanded on the horizontal axis or the x-axis. If the demand schedule refers to a table depicting the demand in quantity terms for good or service at varying price level, and the demand curve is a graphical representation of the same, the demand function is also a representation of the relationship between the price and the demanded quantity in mathematical equation. Here's an example. QD is equal to F and P. This states that the quantity demanded depends on price. QD equals A minus BP. This states how the price of a good or service determines the quantity demanded. So technically, it is a demand equation using data from a demand schedule or a demand curve. This brings us now to the law of demand, which states that if price goes up, the quantity demanded of a good will go down. Conversely, if price goes down, the quantity demanded of a good will go up. Ceteris paribus. The reason for this is because consumers always tend to maximize satisfaction. Now let's move on to change in quantity demanded versus change in demand. Economists use similar terms for two things which are quite different: a change in the quantity demanded versus a change in demand. It can be a little confusing, so let's review. A change in quantity demanded refers to a movement along a fixed demand curve that's caused by a change in price. A change in demand, however, refers to a shift in the demand curve that's caused by one of the shifters: income, preference, changes in the price of related goods, and so on. Let's illustrate the difference with a refreshing example. We'll use soft drinks. Suppose the price of soft drinks goes from $3 to $4. What happens? Well, the quantity demanded decreases from, let's say, 200 to 150. There's a decrease in the quantity demanded, marked by movement along the demand curve, but there's no change in the existing demand curve. Now, let's look at the change in the demand. In this case, a decrease in demand of soft drinks, caused by a viral marketing campaign for a naturally sweetened sparkling water. People just aren't as excited about soft drinks anymore. And so, the decrease in demand shifts the entire demand curve down to the left, and leads, as we know, to lower quantity at every price. In the first case on the left, we have a decrease in the quantity demanded. That is a movement along a fixed demand curve. In the case on the right, we have a decrease in demand. The entire demand curve shifts down to the left. An easy way to remember this is that our graph tracks changes in price and quantity. If a change occurs in a variable other than the price or quantity, that is, something not measured on either axis, that will represent a shift in the demand curve. Price is on the vertical or y-axis, so a change in price alone will cause movement along the curve. A change in income, population, taste, etc., none of these are measured on either axis, and thus we'll see a shift in the entire demand curve. Now, let us move on to supply. Economists define supply as the quantity of a good or service that firms or producers are willing and able to offer for sale at a given price within a period of time. It is a product made available for sale by firms. It should be remembered that sellers normally sell more at higher price than at lower price. That is because higher price results to a higher profit. And now for the law of supply. Understanding the behavior of sellers provides some insight into the concept of supply. For example, imagine Trex Chocolate, a firm that produces and sells chocolate bars. When the price of chocolate rises, Trex will produce more chocolate bars. Other firms will act in similar fashion. Economists call this relationship the law of supply. The law of supply is a fundamental principle of economic theory which states that keeping other factors constant, an increase in price results in an increase in quantity supplied. In other words, there is a direct relationship between price and quantity. So, for the method of supply analysis, just like demand, supply can also be analyzed through a supply schedule, supply curve, and supply functions. And so, let's talk about supply schedule. A supply schedule shows how much of a good or service producers will supply at different prices. Generally, the information provided by a supply schedule can be used to construct a supply curve showing the price or quantity supply relationship. As the price of a good or service rises, the quantity supplied of that good or service also rises. Likewise, as the price of a good or service falls, the quantity supplied of that good or service falls. Notice that only two variables are included, price and quantity. That's all the law of supply includes. It states how a change in the price of a good or service will affect the quantity supplied of that good or service. Since we've got the demand curve down, let's move on to the supply curve. A supply curve shows how much of a good suppliers are willing and able to supply at different prices. As with the demand curve, there's a supply curve for every good and service. So a supply curve is a graphical representation that illustrates that as the price of a good or service rises, the quantity supplied of that good or service also rises. Likewise, as the price of a good or service falls, the quantity supplied of that good or service falls. While the supply function is a mathematical expression of the relationship between supply and those factors that affect the willingness and ability of a supplier to offer goods for sale. Now, let's talk about change in quantity supplied versus change in supply. You might also notice that there are two types of changes can occur, quantity supplied and change in supply. A quantity supplied will occur when there is a movement along a given supply, caused by a change in supply price. The only factor that can cause a change in quantity supplied is price, and the movement is only along the curve. While the change in supply happens when the entire supply curve shifts leftward or rightward at the same price. Therefore, less or more amount of a good or service is supplied by producers or sellers. So in leftward movement, supply decreases if the entire supply curve shifts leftward. Hence, at the same price, fewer amounts of a good or service are sold by producers, while rightward movement will illustrate an increase in supply amounts of a good or service that is supplied by producers or sellers at the same price. So, the change in supply generally refers to a shift in the supplied curve that's caused by one of the shifters: technical change, future expectations, number of sellers, weather conditions, government policy, and so on. And so this technical change, future expectations, number of sellers, weather conditions, government policy, and so on, these are forces that causes the supply curve to change. That's a shift from left or right. For example, a new technology would allow producers to produce a particular product at lower cost, so they would be willing to produce and sell more. This would shift the supply curve to the right because the quantity of that particular product supplied would be greater at each given price. Now, let's proceed to market equilibrium. We know from previous lessons that the demand curve and the supply curve show how buyers and sellers respectively respond to changes in the price of a good. In this lesson, we'll show you how the interactions of buyers and sellers determine the price. Let's start with this. The equilibrium price is the price where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied, right here. And this is the equilibrium quantity. Why is this the equilibrium price? At any other price, forces are put into play that will push the price towards the equilibrium price. It's kind of like a ball in a bowl, where the ball always returns to one stable position. The equilibrium price is the only place where the price is stable. So let's say the price of oil is currently $50 a barrel. That's above the equilibrium price of $30 a barrel. At $50, the quantity supplied is more than the quantity demanded. So we say there is a surplus. So what happens? It's sale time! When there is a surplus, sellers can sell as much as they would like to at the going price. So sellers have an incentive to lower their price a little bit, so they could outcompete other sellers and sell more. The price will continue to fall until the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied, and equilibrium is reached. Now, let's say the price is less than the equilibrium price, say $15 a barrel. At $15 a barrel, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, a shortage. And what happens now? When there's a shortage, buyers can't get as much of the good as they want at the going price, so they compete to buy more by bidding up the price. Now, since buyers are easy to find, sellers also have an incentive to raise the price. The price will continue to rise until quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied and equilibrium is reached. At any price other than the equilibrium price, the incentives of the buyers and sellers push the price towards the equilibrium price. Only the equilibrium price is stable. And that's it for today's lesson. Goodbye!